When I was starting my year of boarding school in France in 1964, was about the same time LBJ and the Americans were starting bombing North Vietnam in a serious way. This was in response to the crisis or perceived crisis or pretend crisis of the Tonkin Gulf, for which Johnson had gotten permission to negotiate war against this small Southeast Asian country. In hindsight, it all looked like it was a sham based on a series of falsehoods, but we didn't know that at the time. That had all started in August of 1964. Well, in the fall, when I was getting to know my roommates in my dormitory at Le Collège Sévenol, on the high plateau of the Massif Central in south central France, they were filled with disdain for my fervor for this bombing campaign. I'm not sure if that was called the Rolling Thunder campaign or not, but it might as well have been. It was the first of our rolling blunders in Vietnam. And at that point, I was all in favor of it. I didn't know any better. They, however, did, my two roommates, Saint-Saëns, Mathieu Saint-Saëns, and Mark Klein, because only 10 years earlier was when their nation, France, had suffered its ignominious defeat in Dien Bien Phu at the hands of General Giap and his forces. They knew something about attacking Vietnam. As an imperialist country, we didn't think of ourselves as imperialists. America. We were the great saviors of the world. Democracy, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, who never told a lie. We knew how the world should work, and we were just trying to teach the rest of the world how it should work, be just like us. So we were bombing the bejesus out of North Vietnam for the first round. And I remember the night we were discussing this, the three of us, Saint-Saëns, Mark Klein, and I, in the dark, each of us lying there on our backs, looking up at the ceiling, our narrow beds, arguing geopolitical politics. And I specifically remember Saint-Saëns' thin voice saying to me rhetorically, "I'll bet you've never even been in Vietnam." Well, it seems unlikely that he had ever been in Vietnam, or Mark Klein. But their fathers might have been. One or the other of their fathers might have been killed in Vietnam, for all I knew. I never asked them what their fathers did, which appalls me now, looking back on it. But I have no idea what their professions were. If Saint-Saëns' father maybe was a professional soldier, maybe he'd been there in that beleaguered bunker in Dien Bien Phu and knew a great deal more about Vietnam than I did. After his first question, Saint-Saëns added, "I'll bet you don't even know where Vietnam is on the map." "Of course I do," I said, the way any good American would, whether he knew where Vietnam was or not. But as it happened, I did know where Vietnam was. And as it happened, I had been to Vietnam once in my short life when I'd been 11 years old, so 4 years earlier. I'd been to Vietnam for about a week with my parents. My father worked in Southeast Asia generally. He ran a council that was based in New York, but did its work across the rim of Southeast Asia. Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, South Korea, Taiwan, Indonesia, the Philippines, all these countries my father knew pretty well for an American. He'd been there a number of times. And in 1960, my parents took me on one of their trips with them. I, the last child in the nest, they had to do something with me when they went on their trip, so they brought me along with them. It happened that in those days the airlines afforded a child of less than 12 years a half-price ticket for international travel. My round-the-world ticket only cost half of theirs. I dressed up in my little suit most of the time. I was quite formal little fella. Serious, too. I studied things. I kind of felt there was some shame in being a child and that I should be an adult or adult-like, which was tragic, looking back on it. I couldn't just be a kid. I had to sort of pretend to be more mature. So I was 11, going on a kind of academic 30 in my mind. We had a good time in Europe on our way to Asia. The presidential campaign of 1960 was gearing up towards its climax. One night when we were in England, in the Lake District, I believe, in our little hotel or bed and breakfast that night, we saw one of the debates between Nixon and Kennedy on black and white TV. And that may have been the point at which I, this super mature 11-year-old, decided I was for Kennedy instead of being for Nixon. I think I'd been for Nixon for some peculiar reason. Maybe some girl I liked said that she was for Nixon. Who knows what 11-year-olds base their opinions on, political or otherwise. Who knows what we adults base our decisions on? No one knows. Anyway, I was seriously for Kennedy after that. And as it happens, November 8th of that year, Election Day, found us in Saigon, in Vietnam. We followed the election results, my parents and I, all day long in Saigon because it was halfway around the world from the USA. Same time people in the States were staying up all night to follow the election returns. We were following them in the daytime. And we learned in Saigon that Kennedy would be the next president. I think the day we learned that was also the day we had our discussion about the drive we were about to take the following day in a car from Saigon northeast about 100 miles to a little town, a village called Bao Loc. Only it seems to have been pronounced Bluff or something like that. In my diary that I kept on that trip, I spelled the name of the town B-L-O-U-G-H. That's not how it's spelled. It's spelled B-A-O-L-O-C. So I have no guess how it's really pronounced in Vietnamese. But we were to drive up there to the agricultural field station my father's council took part in 100 miles from Saigon. There were 5 or 6 adults discussing this trip in advance. My parents, the man who was Dad's representative at the field station, and his wife, and an official or two from the embassy. It was at the embassy that we had the discussion. And it was there that Dad's representative's wife got terribly upset at the prospect of driving to this place where they lived in a car that had U.S. markings. She insisted emphatically that we must take a car that had no markings, that was neutral and would not appeal to the Viet Minh as a target as we drove through the jungle on the way to Bao Loc. She was very nervous about being in a car with American markings. No one else said anything. I certainly didn't say anything. I just followed it with great interest, this conversation. And I especially studied her because she was so nervous. Her fear was palpable. I could taste it. She was so fearful, and the others didn't seem to be. They minimized her fear, rather dismissing it, and her husband seemed a bit embarrassed that she was making a scene in front of this man, my father, who was, after all, his boss. But she couldn't help herself. She was very anxious at the prospect of this trip. Nonetheless, The next day, we took off. And we drove, I think it was Highway 20, the main road from Saigon up to Bao Lo, through jungle clearings. I was looking around for ambushes as an 11-year-old would. Where were these people lurking with guns behind the palm trees and other sorts of trees and bushes? I didn't see them. They were very good at hiding, I decided. I was waiting for a boom. We drove in peace to Bao Lo. We made it there. May have taken several hours. We couldn't drive very fast on this highway. There wasn't much traffic, but we made it without incident. And then the next day, we got word that there had been an attempted coup d'etat in Saigon, which must have begun very soon after our departure from Saigon. It mostly took place overnight of the night of November 10th and 11th. Lieutenants or colonels in the paratrooper division and the Marines of South Vietnam trying to overthrow Ngo Dinh Diem, running the government of South Vietnam. It seems that the main strategy for defeating them was that Diem stayed up all night talking with them until his own troops arrived on the scene and defeated them. He was a great jabberer, Diem, a talkative, rotund little fellow. He was a Catholic in a country that was mostly Buddhist, wore white suits, and was very tenacious. So that night, he beat back these insurgents. And we heard about it either on our arrival in Bao Lo or the next morning. I was very excited, especially at the word that this man who claimed to be an army attaché, who came and told us about this in breathless excitement, because the phone lines had been cut, evidently, between us and Saigon. He told us that there had been quite a bit of gunfire in Saigon around the presidential palace, and that the bridges had been blown on this road we had taken, Highway 20, from Saigon to Bao Lo. As I pictured it, as soon as we got over the bridge, boom, it blew up. And then another bridge we'd pass over and we'd go around a corner. We'd go far enough where we couldn't hear it, and then boom, that one was blown. These bridges were blown, the man said. So I was picturing these Viet Minh people, whoever they were, and however they were dressed. I didn't know they looked like they were dressed in pajamas. I didn't learn that until later. Pictured them taping bundles of dynamite to these bridges. Our good luck had it that they waited until just after we had rolled over the bridge, and then they would tape their bundle of dynamite and plunge the plunger, and the bridge was blown. But we had whisked through. Just barely made it. Well, I didn't tell Saint-Saëns about that as we lay in the dark. I didn't tell Mark Klein. I thought my own rather smug teenage thoughts as I lay in my narrow bed, looked at the ceiling. Didn't tell Saint-Saëns, yes, I had been in Vietnam. Yes, I'd nearly been blown with a bridge by the Viet Minh. But I was in favor of this bombing campaign that Johnson had started up on false pretenses. To be patriotic was the thing we'd been trained to be, as we'd been kids in school, saying the Pledge of Allegiance and all that. America was the greatest nation ever, anywhere. This was drummed into us in school and by our politicians. We knew best for the world. Well, we were in Bao Lo for about one day, and the high point of our day there was this news that the bridges had been blown. For me, it was a high point. And the main high point was that some very nice guy offered me his motorbike to ride around the field station. And then within a day, we were removed to the resort town of Dalat, a little further up in the highlands. where we'd be more secure, this army man was telling us. I was a little skeptical of this army man for some reason. He seemed a bit slick. It could well be that he was actually a CIA character. The bridges were blown, so we couldn't drive back to Saigon. We waited around for a plane from Dalat. And on November 14th of 1960, I said, the last 2 days we've been waiting for Air Vietnam to start flying again. Probably a CIA airline. We've been in the company of MAAG, all in capital letters, MAAG, Military Assistance Advisory Group, I found out later. Curfews, etc. I sound suitably unimpressed with the formality of all this. And then on the 15th, I note that, well, today we finally got a plane. One went empty the other day because nobody knew about it. We're now in Saigon. So we got back to Saigon, and I was thrilled to find that the presidential palace, when we went and took a look at it, did have nicks and holes from bullet shots in our absence. Quite a bit had happened while we'd been in Vietnam. Kennedy had been elected, bridges had been blown, I'd ridden a motorbike, and I'd seen a woman be very nervous about driving from Saigon up country to Bao Loc, where she lived. And she had been right to be nervous. The rest of the adults who had poo-pooed what she was saying had understated the reality of life in Vietnam for Americans those days and in the years to come. She had been prescient. And maybe that lesson, that the people who seemed to know most had known least, informed to some degree my response when little Saint-Saëns had said to me in his superior tone, "I bet you don't even know where Vietnam is. You've never been to Vietnam." Well, I had been.